Hey everyone, thanks for being here. Before we get into it with our next guest, I just want to take the opportunity to ask our audience to support our mission. Please leave a like, a comment, subscribe to the channel, and if you really like it and enjoy it, share with your friends and family. All the love is appreciated. Thank you very much. To the podcast. Crowley, I'm so happy to have you on my show. How are you?
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm delighted to have made it to your show, despite my technical incompetence.
But it's yours and mine. I don't think neither you nor me are very too tech savvy, but we make it happen. Roger, I must say, I discovered you some years back because I've always enjoyed reading about the history of my country and so on. And then some years back, I got bored. I started looking online for some new books to read. So I obviously found your book, The Conquerors and How Portugal Forged the First Global Empire. And I liked it so much so that I even bought the other one, Spices. And I started to listen to the Constantinople one, but I just barely started this week with that one. So, but I must say, your technique in writing really brings the story to life. We feel like we're with the characters on their voyages. So thank you so much. And it's such a great introductory level book for people to really learn about what was going on at the time.
Oh, thank you for your endorsement. I'm glad you enjoyed reading them. Yeah, it's such a reward to know, when people say the book has really meant something to you. When you've been sitting in a room for 3 years trying to read medieval Portuguese very slowly.
Did you happen to learn the language as well?
I realized that I needed to read some stuff in the original. And although it's amazing how much you can get in English, actually, but some of the chronicles from the 16th century, you get a page, like that with no paragraphs. So it was quite hard work, but quite rewarding, really. Yeah, it was. I mean, the thing that most interests me really is to hear the voices of the people of the past, really. That's what I like. I like first-hand accounts of I was there, I did that. Quite often you can't tell if people are telling the truth or not, and you've got no way of, a lot of the time, of verifying something. So you have to kind of take people at their face value, which is probably a mistake. But speaking Portuguese is something that I have, infelizmente, not quite mastered yet. I love that sound, meow. Sou inglês in London, now falo Portuguese. I love the sound of the language, but I spent several months with a language check trying to get the sound of Rio de Janeiro right, and I have not managed it yet.
No, that was pretty good. All right, Roger. Just maybe kick this off by you explaining to us a little bit about why you're an English major, but you end up getting into history because you had a fascination for history, and then consequently, how you got into wanting to learn about the Portuguese history.
How did I get to Portuguese history? I've been to Portugal quite a lot, actually, just for holidays, and I really enjoy it. I like the Portuguese countryside. I like Portuguese people, but I'm very interested in maritime history. Anyway, my dad was a naval officer, and I spent a lot of time in my childhood in naval bases, so I'm very interested in the history of the sea. The Portuguese history thing came about when a man with a very long Portuguese name sent me an email, Pascal Monteiro do Barros, and I said, he'd read my other books, and he said, I live about 15 miles away from you. I don't know how you work this out. Come and have a drink with me. So I drive 15 miles down the road and to an enormous house. And after a few drinks, I've agreed to write a book about Portuguese history. And he's very passionate, this guy, about the history of Portugal, and that the history of Portugal has been undersold, really. And, I think that's right.
Thank you so
And
much
he
for
lent me a
acknowledging
couple of
that.
books, and I realized this is an extraordinary story, really,
Mhm,
about which I knew absolutely nothing. I mean, we've all heard of Vasco da Gama,
mhm.
but, that's about it. And when I started
Yeah.
to delve into this in the books that he gave me, I realized that this was intricate but absolutely extraordinary explosion of the Portuguese out of their country in the 15th and early 16th century. And I
Mhm,
got really hooked on it. I got really, really excited by the tales that people told, by the adventure, by the smartness actually of the Portuguese enterprise, really, in the 15th and 16th century. So
mhm.
I realized it was a great story to tell, because
Thank you,
it's actually
and thank
very
you so
little
much for
known.
sharing it.
My theory is that in the 19th century, if you look at European history or
Yeah,
history, just looking at it from the British point of view, Vasco da
yeah, yeah.
Gama was well known and was a kind of a seminal figure in the history of the voyages of discovery.
Mhm.
But then, when the Americans took up Vasco da Gama got rather pushed into the background
Yeah,
by
that's right.
making, by their new patron saint, really, and and the story's got lost. Really, the story has got lost. Actually,
And then
we have a very England and Portugal also have quite strong links. Um,
oh, yeah.
I did find out actually that Vasco da Gama's great grandfather came from a small village about 15 miles away from where I live, place called
Currently?
Sudley. And yep,
Yeah,
and when you go to the Caixa do Sodré and have a drink on
yeah.
the waterfront, this really means the key of the Sudleys, these people from where I
Wow,
live. It was a wonderful story.
interesting.
I tell it to all Portuguese people just to impress
That's
them.
good to know.
But this and it goes further back with Crusaders helping to capture Lisbon, and Second Crusade, was it? So there is that strong link. But I
Yeah.
but I was absolutely fascinated by I think the cleverness actually of the 15th century, particularly under John II, João II, of
Oh, yeah.
of coming up with a structured plan year after year. Send a ship out, it gets to a certain point, put up padroa, whatever you call them,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
go back, the next ship realizes that, okay, we've got to that point, we go a bit further,
Mhm,
and also the feedback mechanisms, that everything
mhm.
that they knew was collected, um, the collecting of creation of maps, charts, um,
Yeah,
latitude information, um, and when NASA in perhaps 20 or 30 years ago were trying to make the claim for investment in exploration without an unknown outcome, they
mhm.
cited the Portuguese and John's structured exploration program as a reason for betting on exploration without knowing really where it's going to end up.
Oh, yeah. All right. So you describe what Portugal's leap into the unknown almost as one of history's biggest feats. What was it at the time that with what psyche or determination? What was it that propelled Portugal into this seafaring?
From one point of view, I think it's poverty, really.
Mhm.
Portugal, 1400, I think, sort of around then, uh, 1 million people, that's all,
Yeah,
blocked from the trade, all the economic action is in the Mediterranean, but then you've got
yeah,
Castile, who is your enemy, and,
yeah,
and you're
yeah.
really locked out, and you're facing the wrong
Really?
way. You're facing out into nothingness.
Yeah.
Um,
We were
Portugal, I think, was
into the
too poor in
end of the
1400
world.
for the king to mint his own gold coins. So
Yeah.
really, there was nowhere to go but out. And because they have this long Atlantic coastline, the Portuguese were really the first people to start to really become expert in the sailing of the Atlantic, and
Mhm.
so their one skill, if you could put it like that, I'm sure they had many other skills, but
Sure.
was sailing, and it was Atlantic sailing.
Yeah.
So, and nobody else. I mean, apart from maybe the Basques in northern Spain, were facing the Atlantic with the same, uh, necessity, really, to fish, and then to start making journeys down the coast and the Cape Verde Islands and so on. So that was that they had nothing to lose. They nowhere else to go. Very poor, reasonably poor agricultural country. So yeah, it's that was a driver, I think, for the Portuguese to step off from the landmass of Europe.
And it is it safe to say that it's true that eventually, when the Ottomans put a chokehold in that Constantinople area, that helped propel them to like accelerate their journeys to find India?
Yeah, definitely. I think that they they move south, they move south, they move south, and with each step on, uh, they're great information gatherers, really. When they make their way around the Cape of Good Hope,
Mhm,
into the Indian Ocean. They're collecting, they're collecting, and
mhm,
really, I mean, there are two strands actually to the appetite, really for entering the Indian Ocean. One was obviously to get spices, and
mhm,
Manuel, King Manuel the second, isn't it? Uh, really was also interested in crusading, which was kind of a bit of a bad idea, really. But so they, the, the, they could see the wealth of Europe when
yeah,
they looked at the Venetians or the Spanish or whatever, and this was their opportunity really to to clean up in a time when there was no other competition. Spices are the ideal long distance commodity,
mm,
fantastically valuable. I mean, the markup from you know say $1 or whatever you want to call it in
yeah.
India. By the time it got to England, it was about 1,000, and it's
Oh, yeah,
ideal commodity because it's lightweight. You can put a lot in your ship,
a
and
lot.
it's reasonably imperishable. So
Mhm,
this is what was driving them. Alongside this, also is this crusading streak, and one of the sort of comedy acts really of this, I suppose, is that they they had a belief that the other side of the Islamic world, which was a barrier for them, was a Christian kingdom.
mm.
That which is actually the kings of Ethiopia. Um, Man they called
Press.
Prester John, and they believed this was an incredibly powerful figure who was going to help them to conquer the world, really. And one of the things that they realize their horror when they get into the Indian Ocean and get to grips with it, that actually it's full of Muslims
Yeah,
who are not
that's
very
right.
pleased to see them. Um,
Uh,
I
but it
mean, they
ends up
did,
being the
and there are
yeah,
comic moments really because they didn't, they couldn't understand the Hinduism. They thought that when they got to India and they saw these deities with 8 hands or whatever, that
uh-huh,
they were really deviant Christians, and they would correct their sort of doctrinal errors. And it was quite a funny moment, really, when they come across the Hindu merchants shouting Vishnu, and they think that actually they're saying Jesus. And it took quite a long time to work out actually there is another religion here that we hadn't known about before.
yeah,
But this is all discovery. They were discovering it, and they were incredibly fast learners, I think, and their feedback, all the time. One of the necessities for all these voyages that when you got back to Lisbon, you handed in all your charts and the information you collected, and this would be
mhm,
fed back into the next expedition. So
mhm, mhm.
this is a model. This is a real model for for that kind of understanding of the world, and also for map making, endless cartography, more and more and more.
But is it true, as they were seeking this Prester John, and when they thought that they were going to help them Christianize Robo, as they got there, as you said, it was a rather poor kingdom surrounded by Muslims. Is it? It's also true that it ended up happening the reverse. That it actually indeed was the Portuguese that ended up helping them in their darkest hour.
They did, yes, they certainly did. But that was kind of a bit further down the road, really, when they made their
Oh,
way into the Red Sea. But
okay.
at that point, and I can't remember the date when they finally reached the Ethiopian kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
They they attempted to kind of push back Islam,
Mm-hmm.
from the Christian world, but actually at that point they were operating on the limits of what they
Yeah.
could do. I mean,
That's,
Manuel had this crazy idea that sail up the Red Sea, land, uh, uh, capture the body of the Prophet Muhammad, hold it
but
to ransom, get Jerusalem back. Manuel becomes the great Christian king. Totally crazy. I mean, because they were learning and expanding so fast that they probably
yeah, yeah.
believed that anything was possible. You know,
Only with that belief they could have achieved what they achieved, right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they did. I mean, I think they achieved an extraordinary amount in a very, very short time. You know, like 15 years, from arriving in the Indian Ocean to establishing Goa, and then being smart enough. One of my heroes here is Afonso de Albuquerque, who I think was a very,
Oh,
very bright guy, um, much much cleverer than King Manuel. Who works out that you can control a large part of the Indian Ocean. There were probably never more than about in the early 16th century, more than about 2,000 Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. You
that's right.
can't
Yeah.
control land,
No.
but you can if you ring the perimeter with forts, which you can defend with quite a few men, because
Yeah.
nobody has the technology to tackle fortified places. So they
Right.
could ring the whole of the Indian Ocean and get critical points both on the coast of Africa, Hormuz, and obviously round to Goa. The one they failed to get was Aden, actually, but this enabled the Portuguese to really control for about 50, 60 years until the Ottomans kind of get into the picture. Almost had
Yeah.
complete control of the spice trade. Um, with a remarkable achievement, and it was almost like actually the prototype of how small countries with maritime history can dominate. And it's almost like a prototype for the Dutch and the English, who worked on the same principle. They couldn't control much territory, but if you control the checkpoints, the mouth of the Red Sea, the mouth of the Persian Gulf, which we're kind of all interested in at the moment, you can be very, very powerful without having to spend a vast amount of time, money, and human energy having vast armies, and this worked for the Portuguese for a long time, and it would certainly went on working when they moved south to Malacca and then into the Spice Islands. So it was a very successful model that they'd come up with.
Yeah, because the other empires did, like, they did have more men, so land armies. So they did manage to work their way inward a bit more. Most of the Portuguese were just trading points amongst the Indian Ocean, right? At
They,
trading ports.
yes, they were. Sort of political dealings with the Hindu and Muslim states of India were quite limited. So they they didn't they they didn't have a great deal of diplomatic overlap, if you can put it like that,
Mhm,
with the large land-based powers of
mhm.
India, both the Muslim ones and the Indian ones. They were able to kind of, what was successful about Goa was that Albuquerque worked out that it was effectively an island surrounded by water,
Yeah.
very easy to defend, um, and so the Portuguese could, really go about their business and control a lot of the maritime trade without having to do the grunt work of of putting boots on the ground, as we don't like to say at the moment.
Yeah. How do you think these Portuguese commanders, like, how did they establish these long lasting alliances with these local leaders, being completely of different cultures?
I think it was a combination of flattery and threat. Um, they, they might invite some local Raja along to a demonstration of cannon fire or something.
Mm.
Um, I can remember one particular incident. Albuquerque's a very clever guy. Uh, One of the local Rajas, Goa, comes along, and he wants to demonstrate to this guy that the Portuguese are invincible. So he gets a man dressed up in armor as a target, and he gets a
Yeah.
man with a musket to fire at him. The
Hmm.
bullets all bounce off. The bullets are actually wax. They're not bullets at all. And this guy's enormously impressed and thinks, "Whoa, there's nothing we can do about these Portuguese. You know, even if we had firearms, it wouldn't make any
Yeah.
difference." Albuquerque was very good at intimidating people. Putting on great shows of pageantry, and so it was. I think it's a combination of trade and diplomatic cleverness and a certain demonstration of raw power in terms of the construction of their forts, of their gunpowder weapons, and the speed and efficiency of their ships. Um, the other thing I think we should say about them actually is that, and this is I think very interesting about Albuquerque, is he's a wise guy. He realizes that if you only have men on these expeditions, you're going to have trouble with the local people over women. And this isn't like, at this stage, there isn't colonization where whole families would go out. This is a world of men. So the answer to this is to allow Portuguese men to marry local women. And this, this is, I think, one of the, alongside, many things which I think are not so good about what the Portuguese did, but they were racially more tolerant, you could say. I mean, if you look at
Yeah.
the way that Britons ruled India in the 19th century, there was a complete pushback in relation to the purity of the white stock. But the genius, in a way, was to create this Creole society, this mixed race society, which I think was an incredibly liberal thing to do. But he realized that if you don't do this, you're going to have violence, you're going to have rape, you're going to have all sorts of things happening. And so I see this as actually one of those genius acts of the Portuguese to intermarry and not to be hung up on racial purity, really.
There were
And that's
amongst,
I think that's an extraordinary tale.
yeah,
To be
they were
honest,
amongst. There's an old saying that says, God created the white man and the black man, and the Portuguese created the mulatto. But it's true because they did intermarry with the races, which is
yeah,
the Creole, right?
yeah,
Because they were the first to actually do that. They intermarried and had
yeah,
mixed children.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's something the Portuguese should be enormously proud of. Actually,
Yeah, I think
I
so
think
too,
I
for
think it
sure.
was an act of genius. And I think Albuquerque, who I have enormous admiration for,
Yeah.
he was just sensible, really,
Hmm.
and therefore, it was he worked his way around, whatever the priest said about this, that, and the other. And
Yeah.
again, I think that's one of Portugal's unique contributions to the world. It certainly in those centuries. Yeah, and I think it's very admirable and very smart.
Okay, going back to what we were talking about, the Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean, it's true that the Portuguese were the first to put the cannons on the carracks, on the ships?
They were, yes. John II, also a very smart guy, another of my heroes.
Yeah.
He actually carried out experiments off the coast of Portugal with cannons to work out the best way of positioning them on ships. Yes, they were the forerunners of that technology, really. Which again, you're looking at some very, very bright people thinking outside of the box. Quite honestly, what this meant, of course, when they got into the Indian Ocean, that there was no competition really as far as they could blast anybody out of the water, because there were no, although there were the presence of gunpowder weapons were there in the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt, and in and to a certain extent I think in some of the Indian kingdoms, but nobody had guns on ships, and therefore therefore this gives you and also they did quite a lot of bombarding of places they didn't like from the coast. If Calicut or somewhere didn't surrender, you just blast them. But it gave them, for a period, again, an absolutely invincible position that nobody could contest. No, they couldn't. The Portuguese had the cannons, and nobody could compete with them really. It only becomes tricky for the Portuguese when the Ottomans start to present themselves in the Indian Ocean, and then they do have a competitor. But the Ottomans, they caused a certain amount of trouble, but it wasn't. They still retained, really, I think, for much of the 16th century, a monopoly, really. And it's only when the Dutch and, to a lesser extent, the English come along, and this relates particularly to the Spice Islands, that I think one of the problems of managing this empire was, I mean, I've heard people describe Manuel II as a clot. I don't know if that means anything in an idiot, really, because he really insisted on trying to manage something on the other side of the world, which he couldn't. And he didn't, and he failed to recognize talent when he saw it, which was, which in the case of people like Albuquerque was there, really. And this and this goes effectively. He wanted all the stuff to come back to the King of Portugal, rather than private enterprise. I mean, this is going to cause a great deal of trouble, really, because you'd send out. Admittedly, if you're in Lisbon, you have absolutely no idea of what the conditions were like, how things operated in the other side of the world. But you have to trust your lieutenants, and Almeida and Albuquerque, were you get talent, and you have confidence in it, really. And he doesn't quite do that, and therefore the poor old Albuquerque dies heartbroken of when he receives the word that he's going to he's going to be replaced. The following year, Manuel, I think, sends a letter out saying, Albuquerque, terribly sorry. Well, forget everything I said about you. But by that time, Albuquerque was dead. So, and of course, when you think about it, the supply chain, it's effectively a 2-year round trip. By the time you've sailed to India, you have to wait for the monsoon, come back again. It's a 2-year cycle. So if you send out an order in 1 year, you're going to get a response 2 years later, probably. So we have to say that it's never going to be a perfect system, but I think it the difference, and I think this is something about the Portuguese, was that, as far as I can see, Portugal had not developed a privatized commercial mentality. And
Okay.
when you come to the Dutch, the Dutch, whereas all these expeditions that Manuel and his successors sent out, they were sent by the king and meant to report back by the king. When the Dutch come along with these effectively private companies, which people invested in, they didn't have to report back to the King of Holland or whatever. They could take decisions much faster and based solely in terms of commercial benefit. They didn't have to worry. They weren't worrying about converting people to Christianity or anything like that. So what you find is that the Dutch East India Company and then the English East India Company were more nimble, really. And we see this when the Portuguese get to the Spice Islands, and they have a monopoly of the spices. But every 6 years, the person who is sent out to be the governor of the Spice Islands is replaced by the king. And because the king is expecting all the money to come back to him, the kind of incentives are not very great for people, So obviously you get a great deal of corruption going on. And what would happen is people would go out for 6 years, get as rich as they can in the most ruthless way. And when the next guy came along, he'd do the same thing.
Yeah.
But Portugal had not developed that kind of
capitalistic mindset,
capitalistic mentality. I don't think the Spaniards had either. And I think to a certain extent, this came with the Protestant countries, actually. And I can't quite exactly say why that is. I think, Venice, normally a Catholic country, we have to exclude them from that because the Venetians said we're Venetians first, then Christians. They understood. They understood business. The Dutch understood business, and the English understood business. But those with a crusading mentality, with a conversion mentality, and a mentality in which all decisions come from a king, makes the whole process slower and more unwieldy, we would say. And we will see the Portuguese, although they, the Portuguese themselves actually, I think, managed to keep developing that themselves, really, in a way. I mean, when you get, Macau, Macau was really a sort of a Portuguese version of Venice, I think, because it seemed to me that this was a settlement of traders, just traders, a bit like the Venetians, doing business with the Japanese, with the Chinese, with anybody who'll do business, and really beyond the reach of the king. And this is like an independent, Portuguese world that's been set up. And I think the further away they got from Portugal, the less was the ability available to control this. And then you see this commercial mentality getting more and more ground, really, in certainly in the Far East. And the Portuguese doing very well out of that, but with less interference from a king, 2-3 years away back in Lisbon. But it is. I find the whole Portuguese story absolutely fascinating because there are so few Portuguese. I think they say of the Portuguese, a small people with the whole world to die in. And I think what interests me is I think you can go almost anywhere in the world and you can find, Brazil, you can find small groups of Portuguese people, can't you?
Yeah.
All doing their stuff. And I find that very fascinating.
But you touch upon the point, and I think it's so true, though, that even today we look at history in hindsight and we see these great men that have achieved great stuff. But at the time, they weren't compensated that well. And you look at even like the Marquis de Pombal. In his 80s, they were trying to trial for him for what he did when he was in power. So they never really treated in life there are people that great. But I will say that maybe because of that, it also led to their demise because if you research it, the early Spanish, the early Dutch, and British explorations had many crews of Portuguese salesmen with them. So they had left Portugal to go look for someone who would pay them more money to do what they knew how to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Magellan expedition
Yeah,
was
yeah,
really Portuguese in origin,
yeah, yeah. And he
and
sailed for the
very
crown for many years.
very largely dependent upon Portuguese know-how because they knew a great deal more than the Spanish did. And
For sure.
yeah, and I think Portuguese pilots, were valuable commodities. So
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. I think that that they, I mean, I think you know, even Columbus. I mean, I think in Spain they called him the Portuguese because
Because
because he
that
learned.
that's a big rabbit hole, but
Yeah. He was married to a Portuguese woman.
yeah,
He learned everything he
in
knew
Portugal.
in
Yeah,
Portugal, and some of those voyages down the coast
in Naval.
in the era of Manuel II. So really, he's
Portuguese technology, Portuguese know-how.
but yeah, I think if you look at the whole period of exploration,
Yeah.
pilots and skillful pilots are a valuable commodity, and you can find um, in the whole of this period people from one nationality sailing on a ship for another nationality. I think the Portuguese ought to lay claim to Magellan's voyages across the Pacific.
No, 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 but it was Portuguese technology and it was a Portuguese salesman who did it. So, that's it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How do how do the Portuguese view their history of this period? With pride?
So, as I've always been interested in the history, I've got the old version, which I think is closer to the facts, and I believe in more. But there's this new generation of the past 10, 15 years, 20 years that has been taught a different narrative of history and only hyper focuses on some negative aspects. And a lot of this modern generation doesn't truly appreciate its contributions to globalizing the world, to mapping out the world as we know it today, and I think it's a pity that they don't know it as well. That's why I'm trying to help share our history. Many good things were done, some bad things were done. It's history, but nonetheless, the whole world experienced it. So, but there are many things that people aren't even aware of that we set the global trading, we set globalization, we set multiculturalism in the sense that we had mixed marriages and so on. So there's many beautiful things that we've contributed into the world that I just want to help share. So thank you so
I,
much for
I think
for
I
joining.
think you're absolutely right. I think the Portuguese have been undersold actually in terms
Yeah.
of their contribution. Really,
But
um,
that I think may go back to what you were saying about how the Protestant countries took a stronghold of the world with the Americas. So then and then they oversold one end, and then the other one is undersold. So that's just how life works.
yeah. I mean, I found doing this work um, um, just so interesting. It was full of
Yeah,
so many interesting little stories. I was a
I
bit
know.
worried as to
Yeah,
what the Portuguese were going to think of this book.
no,
Um, um,
it's all
um,
good.
I haven't pleased everybody. I have to say, I, w- I went to Pakistan
Hmm.
to a literature festival, and I was asked to give a talk on the Portuguese. The Portuguese. The Portuguese ambassador was in the audience, and
Hmm.
I did say that not everything the Portuguese did was good,
Hmm.
and I quoted because it is remembered, and certainly in Malacca, the destruction of this um, pilgrim ship, the Miri, by Vasco da Gama, who blasted it to bits, really. And it's quite clear from the evidence that people on Vasco da Gama's ship also thought that this was a horrible thing to do. And I mentioned this, this is, in my talk, I said, this is particularly possibly because I was talking to a very largely Muslim audience, that this was an atrocity. And when I got to the end, the Portuguese ambassador stood up. It's a huge auditorium, and I couldn't hear very well, but I could say I'd made this man very, very angry because, and I could see he was going to say, he was saying things about hypocrisy because Brits did the same. Well, yes, of course they did. Anyway, I don't know why I'm telling you all this, but but I think that the Portuguese have a right to be proud of their history. Really, it is special. It's discovered so many little things that just absolutely fascinated me about these people, and which are hardly known. I think it does go, as I say, it slightly goes down to the Columbus thing, although the Americans know how to ditch Columbus because he was a bad guy. How large a community of Portuguese people are there around where you live, Stephen? Is there a community?
So in the Toronto area, well, they say in Canada there's officially 500,000.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but there's more because there's too many of them that don't even have their like up to the third generation, that they don't have their Portuguese documents, but they identify it with their blood lineage. They're Portuguese, right? So there's many. There's many here in the U.S. They say it's 1.5 million, but there's clearly many more.
Yeah. There's more people with the whole world to die in. Well, hopefully to live in. I mean, all that cod fishing, it must have introduced the Portuguese to Canada quite early on, really.
Well, Real was a Portuguese fisherman. He had been fishing in Newfoundland in 1472, so that was 20 years before Columbus went to the Caribbean.
Yeah. I think one of the great regrets is really looking at Lisbon. Really, is the earthquake, really, because it must have devastated so much of what was a magnificent city, and obviously, when you look at the Girondins monastery or the fort and so on, you think that all wiped away, and yeah.
Can I ask you a question? In our modern society, we see movies about the Vikings and the Spartans and all these things. With all the knowledge you have on the Portuguese history, don't you think it's worthy of like some mega production, like a Game of Thrones type of thing?
I think it would be great, actually. I think so. I think the trouble is, the Americans, want, that's what they've done. But I think the stories are so extraordinary, really. And I'm just at a moment I've dug up some notes I wrote about the period before, earlier in the 15th century, about voyages down the coast of Africa, and it's extraordinary little tales, really, of people trying to sail up the Congo, or the great rivers of Africa, because they think they might be able to cross Africa. A man gets dropped on the coast of Africa, speaks Arabic, spends a year with the Bedouin, gets picked up a year later. There's tales of adventure and all sorts of things, and for God's sake, the Portuguese monks who walked across the Himalayas, to China. The introduction of firearms into Japan. These guys who land on the coast of Japan with a couple of muskets and give a demonstration of shooting. And Japan, this changed Japan's history, really. But suddenly it became there's so many stories in there, really. I think.
that's another one. For example, the Japan thing, because now I think it's always going to be an uphill battle for the Portuguese to sell their history because American like production is more favorable to like Protestant countries, let's say, because even in that show, that Netflix show that came out a year or two ago about Shogun, yeah, it's sold in a Dutch perspective, right? So it's always going to be an uphill battle for someone to center around the Portuguese perspective. And I don't think they have that kind of a budget in Portugal to do it. Hopefully they do, but
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a story waiting to be told. But we just need
yeah,
to find somebody to do it. Really, I think,
yeah, I know.
you know, because the stories are so good, they're so good, uh, uh, and there's so many, weird things happen. And,
Can I?
um,
Can you name Portuguese titan names that really helped secure the Portuguese global empire?
right. Well, Alfonso de Albuquerque is my number one, really.
Okay. Let me ask you one more question.
Yeah.
Do you think Bartolomeo Diaz gets the credit he deserves? Because when you look at it, he was the first to round the tip of South Africa. When he came back, he helped them develop a larger ship in the Caribs. He was with Vasco da Gama on his first voyage, and he was also with Pedro Alvarez Cabral when he went to discover Brazil. So I think he deserves a much heavier name. But
Yeah.
do you think
Yeah.
he's
No,
not as credited?
I think I'd go with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Do Is it your feeling that this younger generation of Portuguese don't really value their past as much as they should, or?
I think they don't value it because they've been conditioned to learn only about the negatives, unfortunately. Because
Yeah.
Portugal has a big connection with Brazil in culture. And the the hyper focus has been on the slavery with the Americas. And that is something that you shouldn't feel good about. So that's understandable. But when it's hyper focused and not analyzed in its fullness, it it paints a harsher picture than it actually was in the time. If you read a book like Slave and Citizen by Frank Tauernbauer, he wrote it in the 40s. He set out through the Americas to study throughout all of Latin Americas and the US and Canada to discover how the slavery worked. And he found a conclusion that it was much different in South America than it was in Northern America. So you can say between Catholic America and Protestant America. And what he uncovers is that it wasn't as it's sold in the movies these days. So I think that's one of the reasons why they're just fed the negatives. They're not fed about how they contributed to these civilizations, to these countries, to how they developed them. Because even the word colony, today, if you Google it, it merely tells you that it's based upon exploitation. But just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, colony meant a group of people who would settle in an underdeveloped place and they would develop the land. That was the settlers. That was what the Portuguese started doing in Brazil and so on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's this mass plantation that happened, cheap labor was required. So as the world, all massive plantations were based upon slavery. And as it was developing in the Americas, it was imported. And because Portugal was trading in Africa and Africa kings had the slaves to sell them, it was a transaction that happened. It's not to be proud of, but it happened, and it would have happened to anybody who would have done it. The Portuguese happened to be the first, but
Yeah.
and it was happening, and it still happens today. There's more slaves today, they say, than it was back then, and no one complains about it. But I think that it's because of that point that brushes us away. But I will tell you one thing: all the Portuguese diaspora they love their country more than most of the people, at least half of the people back home. Half of the people back home in Portugal love their country. Half of the people think that everything sucks. Everything that comes from outside is better. We didn't do
Mm.
nothing. So I will say that the whole of the diaspora is very patriotic and very proud of what they've done, and even what they do today. This migration happened 70 years ago. Like we've developed beautiful communities along the world, and and everyone's proud of being Portuguese. Only in Portugal you feel it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the way, really. But yeah, I mean, things change in different generations, don't they? Really, I mean, I think what strikes me as total outsider is that Portugal. Every time we come to Lisbon, it looks different.
Yeah.
The Portugal seems to have been discovered, if you like,
Yeah.
by you know, by a huge number of people. I mean, I don't know if it's tax breaks or whatever, or what, and I don't
Yeah.
know whether
Yeah.
that's changing the way that Portugal operates and how people
Yeah.
feel about their country, the sort of digital nomads and foreigners buying up properties, all that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's happening. It's definitely happening. That increases the market, which the locals can't afford. So, then there's that. Portugal is always a welcoming country and is, but now there's also a group of people who are against the incomers. So it's a difficult situation to understand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the way the world goes, isn't it? Really,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
am so. I think I enjoyed writing this book. I've written
Oh,
about
and I
6
enjoyed
books,
it so much. Thank you.
as much as any of the books, because
Yeah.
I started from the basis of knowing nothing. My mentor in this, Pascal, got me to talk to all kinds of people and sort of step on board a caravel and all sorts of interesting things, because I knew nothing. I was in the position of just like everybody else, of knowing nothing
Mhm.
really, although
And
I had been to
discovering it.
Portugal and liked it, uh,
Mhm.
and just being astonished by how rich and how interesting it is, really. So,
Also,
yeah, and I think people need to be proud of their. Yes, we've all,
also,
we can
yeah.
talk about the Raj and terrible things it did and blah blah blah,
Mhm.
but also I think people need to be proud of the contributions they have made to the development of civilization.
Yeah.
And Portugal, punches above its weight, really, in that
Yeah.
respect. Um, but I think a lot of it is to do with that position on the Atlantic coast and having to go out
Mhm.
into the world because you're stifled by Castile behind.
Mhm.
That has made them very enterprising. Very
Mhm.
enterprising people.
Yeah, because
So
they end up stitching the world together. Like basically the Atlantic was isolated from the East, and when they discovered that sea route, it really opened up the world to globalization. So it
yeah.
really did change the world forever.
Yeah, yeah. So, and
And
anyway, I was very grateful for the, for the,
mm,
for the email from the man who invited me to go and have a
for
drink.
the if I was forced to
It occupied 3 years of my life.
instead of doing it via emails, I would have made this invitation for us to be in person because I find it so fascinating when I talk to historians and people who really enjoy like study and get into the details. And when I found that you were available to do this show, I was more than excited because I really want
Well,
to share our history. And I think you do such an amazing job in your books, all of them. But because you wrote this one particularly about around the early ages of the sea route to India and establishing those trade ports, like I was like, no, I want to share this story. So if when you could come on, I was so happy and appreciative of
oh,
it.
well, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
is there any project that you're working on currently?
um, I'm at the moment. I'm sort of doing something a bit lazy.
Yeah.
I'm. Uh, I've written a lot of stuff in magazines, and I've got a whole lot of material that I've not used. So I'm putting together a book, which is a series of articles
Mhm.
about the things that I've written about. And actually,
Mhm.
I've dug up a whole lot of work I did about the Portuguese during the time of Henry the Navigator, or whatever you want to call him, down the
Yeah,
coast of
yeah.
Africa, and absolutely fascinating stories. So really, I'm going to be it's going to be a collection of articles with quite a lot about the Mediterranean, some about some will be about Portugal, some will be about seafaring around the world, a certain amount about the Ottomans, because I'm quite interested in Turkish history. So it's going to be like, I don't know if anybody will want to read it, but it's things I've written would like to put in front of a larger audience, really. So, because these books take about, the Portuguese book was about 4 years, it was about 4 years work. And I'm 74 now or something.
Yeah.
But
you look like a charm. I think you probably got another 20 years.
Yeah, well, thank you. We'll hope for the best. Yeah. Well, look, I apologize for my technical incompetence, but my wife saved me from death, really, and immediately.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Maybe we will meet again. Yeah.
Yes, I hope so. So for those watching, I do have the book over here. I'm just going to plug it in one more time. If you live in Canada or the USA, you can find it on Amazon. It's easy. It ships within days. It's a great it's a great book about our history, but you don't have to be Portuguese. If you're interested in knowing how the globalization started, how global trading started, it's what you need to know. Also, if you are Portuguese and he has another book called Spices, which is about how Spain secured the spice trade and started to develop in Mexico. But about a third of the book is centered around Magellan. So another Portuguese face. So if you want to dig deep into that, that's a great read too. Roger Crowley, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Really enjoyable talk.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Ciao. Have a good one. Thank you.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and hit that like button below. Obrigado e até a próxima.